Hi, I'm Caryn Ward. I am an implementation scientist. I have spent the last 12 years of my career focusing on supporting state departments of education, school districts, county offices of education, and other nonprofit agencies, and how they can use the science of implementation to support uptake and use of different practices and programs to get to the improved community outcomes they're wanting to see. So I'm coming at you from Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm currently a Director of Implementation Science Research and Practice at the Research Triangle Institute Internet, or RTI International. Implementation science is the study and the use of various methods, tools, and techniques that support the adoption, the implementation, the sustainability, and the scalability of programs that have some level of evidence to them, whether that is been demonstrated by empirical evidence through research and or practice evidence, those that have been generated out of doing the work on the ground. So implementation science, if I were to describe it to, say, someone who hasn't heard of it, I would describe it as systematically planning and intentional time and effort on what are the key activities that we need to engage in to help someone do something, right? The something could be a specific instructional practice that we're wanting to see use within classroom. It could be using a particular data system or IT software, right? There's something, and we're intentionally planning for and looking at what activities are needed to help to help a person to do the something well, right? So that we can get the outcomes that that practice or that program is supposed to be producing. So an example would be if we're wanting a teacher to use a specific instructional practice, implementation science focuses in on what activities are needed to support the teacher to engage in that practice well, so that it can have the impact on student learning that we'd want to see. So implementation science begins, like with other improvement approaches, with understanding what is your need, right? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? But then it differs from other improvement approaches, because implementation science says, okay, we've identified this need. We then go to what evidence do we have already available to us that we want to look at selecting or adopting to address that need, right? So our first step after that need is to go to what we know already works and has some level of effectiveness to it, whether that is coming from an empirical evidence base, like say it's something I've found on the What Works in Schools clearinghouse, or in other menus or clearinghouses that are out there, to also practice evidence, what has been demonstrated to work as well. The key there is that it has already some level of effectiveness that's telling us this is worthy to put our efforts into for implementation, versus the alternative of designing something brand new, and starting from scratch. Now, what sometimes is often a misnomer in people's understanding of implementation science is that we take that evidence-based program or practice or evidence-informed innovation, whatever language you want to use there, and you automatically pluck that in and you take it as it is. That doesn't work because implementation science recognizes context matters. So even when you're starting with something that has evidence behind it, you still have to work through your use of implementation science and improvement methods and tools of how to make that program best fit and work within your local context of where you're wanting it to be implemented. So you can take an evidence-based program that is out there and how it looks on the east side of a state may be different from how it works on what it looks like in the west side of a state, just as a silly example, but context matters. So yes, we start with something, but we also have to attend to and make it work within our local context, which is where we see a lot of overlap with other improvement methods in the use of data and plan, do, study, act cycles, for example. Implementation science loves those. I don't know how to do implementation science without a plan, do, study, act use of that methodology to really figure out what works, what doesn't work, and where do I need to make improvements or changes, and then to test those as you go forward. So, in our education work, implementation science is ideally used at every level of our education system. So, what I mean by that is that our state departments of education and their specific role that they play in supporting our local districts and schools to use effective practices to meet students' needs, they're using implementation science and how they're doing that. That if there is a regional structure within a state education system, like a county office of education, for example, they have a role that they play in implementation and can make use of implementation science tools and strategies to support districts and schools. Districts and schools often can use implementation science methods and strategies and tools as well. So we can use implementation science from, say, the capital of the state level all the way down into the classroom, where our teachers and our other instructional staff and practitioners are serving students and families. There's other key important players involved in implementation. It is not just leaders who are using implementation science, it is really about engaging the staff and giving the work back to them, to have them have a voice in the planning of implementation and driving the implementation efforts. Also, families and students' caregivers also need to be part of implementation efforts and be engaged in using implementation science. And finally, you have other partners in the community that can collaborate with states and districts and schools and their use of implementation science. For example, institutes of higher education and our universities are critical from a research standpoint and being a research partner within that implementation work, and also providing the direct support as well, or that training and technical assistance. You also have, beyond institutes of higher education, you have the program developers or the nonprofit organizations who are developing programs or initiatives or practices or innovations that schools and districts want to implement. They too also have a role to play within the implementation effort. So, implementation science is very inclusive. Everyone has a role to play within it, and without them, implementation can go wrong when we think about it. Implementation science is for researchers and for our education practitioners, whether you're a leader or you're an instructional staff providing direct services to students. For why you're using implementation science matters. So, for example, researchers can use implementation science frameworks to really guide their questions that they're striving to answer about implementation. So, for example, if I'm really trying to answer the questions, how what works for who and in what circumstances, right? I could use, for example, the consolidated framework for implementation research. It's an implementation science framework to guide me more specifically in what types of implementation outcomes or constructs I should be attending to in various domains to answer those questions, right? That's often how researchers are using implementation science, right? They're using frameworks from the field to really guide the hypotheses that they're making, the development of their research questions, what constructs they're assessing, and methodology of how they're trying to answer those questions. Implementation science provides us with different types of experimental designs to be able to answer those questions as well, like a hybrid effectiveness trial, for example. Implementation science can also be used by program evaluators. So maybe it's not conducting empirical research to inform a generalized body of knowledge, but I really want to get in and understand what impact is this particular program or practice having on our system, on our staff's knowledge and skills, and able to use the program. And the ultimate always goal is, how is it improving outcomes for our communities and our families and the students that we're serving. I can use implementation science methods and tools like different surveys and looking at specific outcomes that I should be measuring in that program evaluation as we go forward. And then the third purpose, right, which is where our practitioners come into play and where I love to play in my work. I love research as well, but my heart is in this work of what I would call implementation practice, right? So implementation research can help guide me, or say a team member, school improvement team member, on what implementation strategies should we be thinking about using to get to those intended outcomes for our staff, our system, and our students, right? Do I need to not just provide training and educational support, but I also need to think about what data do my teachers have access to really drive their improvement? What are effective communication messages and methods that we need to be attending to create readiness within our school community for perhaps a new practice? Or maybe it's communication and messages around what practices are ineffective that we're going to be stopping, and that we need to be attending to a replacement practice or a new practice, and why, right? So as a practitioner, I can use what we know about our effective implementation strategies from implementation science to guide my implementation work. Implementation science is good for supporting achievement of a priority or an initiative that your organization has, whether that's at a district level, state level, or school level, where you've identified specific evidence-based solutions or practices. Again, can be based in empirical evidence or practice evidence that you're wanting to implement and take to scale, and have sustained implementation. That is what implementation science is good for. I would also add to it that sometimes people think implementation science has to, or is a top-down approach, like you start with leadership and only leadership, whether that's starting at a state level or starting at a district level and flowing it down, versus a bottom-up approach where it's really the innovation is found by those that are doing and feeding that up into the system for adoption. A really good implementation science work, you are engaging in the work from both a top and a bottom up. I kind of go like this when I'm training people, to say we have to engage individuals at all levels, right? So that, because they each have a role to play, or as an actor in that system, in order to support good implementation happening and getting to the outcomes that we want. Implementation science works best when there are several conditions in place, I would say. One is that the district or the school or whatever the organization is that's doing the implementation has experienced some failure, right? So they've tried some stuff and they're unsatisfied with the outcomes that they have produced, right? Despite their efforts. So I say that's a condition because there's a recognition of a need to be able to want to do something different, right? To tackle it something different as one condition. Another condition I would say that where it works best, and this is going to sound contrary, but when there's not this like income of resources that you have to use. because implementation science is really about using what's in your current context to make it work. And when people rely on an influx of resources, like we're seeing with the ESSER dollars, for example, in most recent years, and then they go poof away, right? They were not, what have we done to ensure that what we put in place are sustaining? So that probably sounds contrary, but I actually like when there's not this influx of funds, because it makes us think about sustainability. Implementation science supports you to think about sustainability from the get-go. Do you know what I mean? Like, there can be an influx of funds that you have to do something with, but we always try to in our work to say, what if you didn't have that? Do you know what I mean? Like, how are you going to sustain this from the get-go? Let's use, how do we leverage different our current resources and systems as we go forward? And I would say people talk a lot about readiness in implementation science, right? Is there readiness for the implementation effort? My response to that is readiness is not this pre-existing condition that just magically appears. You have to cultivate it and actively create it through your implementation work. So that's often sometimes people think, well, there's got to be a certain level of readiness as a condition. And I say, no, like you're never going to find the perfect readiness. It's more about how are you going to create it as you go forward. It's challenging to use implementation science in different contexts when people are in a rush and not wanting to give the time that implementation takes. So when you are systematically engaging in the use of implementation science, it takes time to do what I would call the good exploration work. How are you going to identify your need? How are, the problem investigation, right? And making the determination and making an adoption decision or selection of what is the practice we're going to put in place to address that. We often shortchange that in our efforts. And then the planning stage or the getting ready, right? We often want to just jump right into doing. So what can be challenging in implementation science is folks wanting to provide the necessary time to do it well and with quality, and not say they're doing implementation science when it's really like surface level implementation work. Do you know what I mean? Like they may be dabbling in it, but they're not doing to the depth or the quality of the implementation work, because it does take time. And we need to give it time. And I always love Wexelblatt's algorithm that said you can pick 3 things. It can be cheap. You can pick 2 of the following 3, I should say. It can be cheap, it can be fast, or it can be good. Can't have all 3. You got to pick 2, right? If you do implementation science well, it's going to be good, but it's not going to be cheap or fast. We can do it on the cheap, but it definitely will not be fast. So I would say that a challenge to implementation is giving it the necessary time to see the impact. And a second challenge related to that is creating value for what some would call the leading indicators or the proximal outcomes or the implementation outcomes we're producing, that's signaling to us we're on our way to getting those outcomes that we're wanting to see for our students and our communities. Too often we zero in on those what lagging or the more distal outcome because they are so pressing and important and we want to achieve those. But there's other data we can be paying attention to tell us we're on our way to achieving that. But that data, often you have to create the value for it. It's not like an automatic thing that will often be present with leaders and staff. So my advice to an educator who's wanting to get in, begin with implementation science is you really have to endorse the mindset of getting started and getting better. We love to be perfectionists often and want to have everything exactly planned out, I's dotted, T's crossed, and whatnot. Implementation science is an iterative process, right? We can't possibly, we can try and mitigate and risk plan for all the potentialities of what's going to happen in our implementation work and try to plan it for, all the way out. But we're doing implementation with real life human beings, and we can't control everything that's going to happen around us in our context and the learning that is going to be generated. And we need to embrace that learning and know that we're going to need to get and use that learning to get better. So be ready that it's going to be messy. It's going to be iterative. I promise it's going to get better. You might have a dip before you see an improvement in outcomes, but the key is persist and start small. Don't do everything at once, right? Start with a few implementers. Start with one thing. That's the other thing that I find people will want to go big and apply it to everything. You got to start small, pick one thing, and be intentional in your learning about it, and take the risks and embrace that learning to get better over time. So, my advice to researchers or others outside of districts and schools or state departments of ed who may be supporting them, and how to advise them in getting ready with to use implementation science, is embracing the mindset. We don't do implementation to someone, we implement with them. So you have to have the knowledge and the competencies in how to broker information, how to connect folks. You need to have the competencies in how to build capacity, how to engage and work in a co-design fashion, if that's whether that's using like a human-centered design process, or but to do implementation well with your implementers, those that are going to be using the practice or program, it truly needs to be a co-creative, co-design process. So I would encourage you to step back and reflect on what are your skill sets and your processes that are critical to being able to do that type of co-design, co-creation work well, in your work as you go forward, and really think about that before jumping in. Because you need to be able to listen and not come in as that external expert, and really engage with the people that are living and breathing in that system of where implementation is happening.